Okay, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first call in relation to the Robert Half Job Confidence Index report. I'm delighted to be working in partnership with the Centre for Economics and Business Research. I'm joined by Josie Anderson from the Cebr, who will take us through the report and answer some Q&A for us at the end. Before I do that, I just wanted to give some insight into why we commissioned the report. So I guess traditional measures for labour market health tend to be based around unemployment and open job vacancies. These are really valuable factors and give us a good indication to the overall health of the labour market. But the UK is very complex. And we wanted to understand it with a little bit more depth as to what was really going on and what we can see from a confidence perspective within the UK labour market. So we partnered with the Cebr to understand this and what are the other factors that employers and job seekers need to consider to make sure that they're making informed decisions and have a wider picture on what's going on within the UK labour market. These things will be based around remuneration, working models, skill, pay, and progression. So there's some great insights that we'll take you through. But before I do that, I'd like to just introduce you to Josie. So Josie Anderson, who works as a managing economic person on the macroeconomics team. That's a mouthful. But she is a managing economist for the Cebr. She's the author of this report, as I said. She also writes bespoke reports and commentary on the general labour market. Her latest works include research into the productivity gap within the UK, as well as forecasting impact on unemployment of the fourth industrial revolution. You may actually recognise Josie as she's often seen on Bloomberg and the BBC, so we're really delighted that she's taken time out to work with us on this report. As I said, I'll ask some questions to Josie at the end, but now to offer the insights into the report, I'll hand you over to Josie.
Thanks so much, Chris, and it's great to speak with you all today. So I'm going to take us through the slides of the report. I'll take us through the actual report, but obviously not every word that's included in it. So please feel free to read the actual report afterwards for even more insights and perhaps some more definitions of what's going on. But I'm going to share, our key findings from the Job Confidence Index from this quarter. Now, this is actually the first quarter of the report. So this is going to be a new quarterly report. So the next report will be on Q1, kind of the quarter that's just finishing of this year. But this report is on the last 3 months of last year, so Q4 2022. And we believe this report will add really valuable insight into the UK labour market. It amalgamates both existing indicators that might affect confidence in the UK labour market, like, for instance, unemployment, but also more niche indicators, perhaps from the Labour Force Survey, looking at things like variance in pay levels and inequality and access to different careers in terms of social mobility, but also new survey-based indicators that add insight into confidence into the UK labour market. And we amalgamate this all into one headline index that is, in a way, a bit of a health check on the UK labour market. So I'm going to take us through the slides. So this is the executive summary of the report. Obviously, I won't take you through every point. Feel free to read it afterwards. But you can see that on the left-hand side, we have some of the key findings from the Jobs Confidence Index. So I'll take you through kind of what the numbers mean, but each quarter it will be a headline number. And so we see that it's 19.9 in Q4 2022, which is positive. The number can be in positive territory, which means it's kind of better than the long-term average, or it can be in negative territory, which obviously indicates it's weaker than average. And that's an average over the past more than a decade, since 2009. But though it stands in firmly positive territory at 19.9, it has fallen by 7.5 points since Q3. So as well as taking you through how we got to that number, 19.9 for Q4, as you can see on the right-hand side, towards the end, we'll also have a bit of a snapshot on the tech industry and also some forward-looking commentary on what we think might happen to the UK labour market and the broader UK economy this year and into the medium term, the years ahead. So let's think, especially since this is the first report, what do the numbers mean? What does 19.9 mean? Well, the index, as I said, amalgamates many different indicators that might impact jobs confidence. And so overall, there are 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14 indicators, but they are divided into 4 pillars: job security confidence, pay confidence, job search and progression confidence, and macroeconomic confidence. And these equally weighted pillars make up the jobs confidence index. So each of these can also take positive and negative numbers. And the long-term average since 2009 is 0. So if it's above that, if it's a positive number, that indicates that it's better than the long-term average. And if it's below, it indicates that it's worse than the long-term average. So each of these pillars and indicators can take a positive and negative number, and that affects the overall average level of jobs confidence, which is the headline number 19.9. So the overall jobs confidence index usually over half the time stands between +30 and -30. So that's kind of it gives you an understanding of where we might usually expect it to stand. So it's towards the top of that range at almost 20 at the moment. But it can take far more extreme numbers. So it's never fallen outside of +80 to -80. But if it did, that would indicate quite an extreme level of jobs confidence. So to take you through the pillars, first of all, we've got job security confidence, and that's made up of 4 indicators that we believe each impact job security. So we've got things like the unemployment rate, labour market tightness, which looks at the share of vacancies per unemployed people, levels of temporary work in the UK economy. So people would obviously feel less secure in their job if it's only a temporary job. And also a survey-based indicator of future employment confidence. Then we've also got a pillar looking at pay, which is of course hugely important to the confidence people feel in the labour market and their incomes. So that looks at real wage growth, which means wages adjusted for inflation. Productivity growth, productivity is highly linked to pay. Pay gaps, so that looks at variance in pay for a given occupational level. So is pay fair, basically, is what it measures. And job earning security, so how much pay might fluctuate month to month. If you can't predict your pay, then you might feel a lot less secure in it. And then also we look at job search and progression. So jobs confidence isn't just, are you able to find a job if you don't have one or if you want to move, but also do you feel like you're progressing in your career, you're making progress. So it looks at things like whether people are working part-time and they want to work full-time, and also a survey-based indicator about how people feel about their career looking forward to the next 5 years. And then finally, we look at 2 different measures of UK macroeconomic confidence, both from a business perspective. Obviously, if businesses feel like they're doing well, they're more likely to hire. And also from the average consumer perspective, people in the labour market, how do they feel about the macroeconomy? How do they feel about how easy it is to go out and buy things, how secure they feel in the economy? So those are the pillars that make up the index. And so to come on to how the index has performed in the latest data, well, this is kind of the key chart for the index. And you can see, as I mentioned, the latest statistic, Q4 2022, it stands just below 20 at 19.9. And this chart also shows how the pillars contribute to that overall headline finding. And we'll come into that, how that happened in the latest quarter in the coming slides. But we can see over time, back in 2009 to 2014, the overall index was consistently negative. So we can see that the global financial crisis and the impact of that over the following years with high inflation, but also you can see most of the pillars were negative for a long period, so weak pay confidence and weak macroeconomic confidence, that had a long-term impact on the labour market that we only saw start to turn positive towards 2016, 2017. And then in the post-COVID years, with this kind of boom in terms of it being relatively easy to find a job, the bounce back from the pandemic, with businesses feeling like they wanted to hire to meet lots of demand, jobs confidence reached by far its highest level. But since then, we can now see it has started to fall back. And of course, there are lots of concerns about the UK economy at the moment. Will we enter a recession is the key question. And so that's why we have started to see it fall back slightly. But yet it remains firmly in positive territory. If we saw this kind of reading of 20 a decade ago, that would be seen as extremely positive. And so though we have started to see it fall, it's still very robust. So we'll go into the reasons for that now. So of the 4 pillars that I took us through, 2 stood in positive territory in the latest data, and that's job security and search and progression confidence. But we can also see that the pay confidence and macroeconomic confidence pillars recorded readings below 0. And so they added kind of a negative pull to the headline index. And I think that's all to do with what's going on in the economy at the moment. So to think more about that, we can see a bit more detail on how these pillars moved. So job security confidence, I said, stood firmly in positive territory, and it's very firmly in positive territory at over 100, which is quite an extreme reading. But yet it actually fell by quite a lot, by the highest amount except macroeconomic confidence, compared to Q3 by 18.3 points. And so this kind of indicates that indicators like the unemployment rate and the number of vacancies per unemployed person, and I'll go through this more in a minute, though are very, very hot. The labour market is hot and it's tight, but it's actually getting a bit looser compared to Q3. Pay confidence stood in negative territory, as I just mentioned, but it actually rose. So compared to Q3, factors like real wage growth that make up that indicator, and actually in particular it was productivity growth and pay gaps, so kind of the fairness of pay, saw an improvement in Q3. So though it's in negative territory, actually that's a positive sign that perhaps things are getting slightly better on some indicators. Similarly, job search and progression confidence actually is the only one that stood in positive territory and rose. So perhaps that's the most robust pillar of the index. So people feel like they can find a job and they can progress in their career. But macroeconomic confidence is both negative and fell. So, I'll go into more about what's going on in the macroeconomy on that slide. But of course, we've got factors such as the cost of living crisis and continued supply chain issues for businesses and some political turmoil, of course, towards the end of last year, as well as things like rising interest rates that are really affecting businesses and consumers and making them have a lot less confidence in the UK economy. To go into more detail on each pillar. So the job security confidence, just as a reminder, that's made up of things like the unemployment rate, vacancy levels per unemployed person, levels of temporary work, and also a survey-based indicator of future employment confidence. So as we can see, this is positive but fell slightly. And actually one of the biggest contributors to the fall was slightly lower vacancy levels per unemployed person. So vacancies were running really hot towards the middle of last year. Businesses were really struggling to hire, which is bad for businesses, but for the people looking for a job, it's relatively easy to find one. Of course, there's a bit of sector differences across vacancies. So in some sectors, it's much easier to find a job than in others. But overall, that gives people a lot of confidence in their ability to find a job if there's over 1 million vacancies in the UK economy. So that's why it's standing so positive, but that's got slightly less tight. There are slightly fewer vacancies towards the end of last year. So that's in particular a reason why that indicator fell. Factors like the survey-based indicator of employment confidence and unemployment, they've been staying fairly stable actually, but unemployment is very low in the UK economy at the moment. The latest reading is 3.7%, You'll never get 0% unemployment. So when it's that low, it's just a sign that we've kind of got full employment in the economy. So this is the next pillar, pay confidence. And this is made up of factors like real wage growth, labour productivity, fairness of earnings, and job earning security. So we can see it was marginally negative. It was very close to zero in the latest reading. And but it actually rose. So that while it's negative, it did rise. And actually the biggest contributor to that rise was fairness of earnings. Perhaps it's a factor of the fact that real earnings haven't been rising. Well, in fact, they've been falling recently, but earnings across a given occupational level have become a lot flatter, a lot fairer. So for a certain level of skills and abilities, you're more likely to earn a similar wage, which we think makes it more predictable and fairer throughout the economy, which we think contributes to a positive figure for pay confidence. The biggest negative finding is job earning security. Kind of people are seeing fluctuating pay over the end of last year, which was a negative contributor to this, and that's why we still see it standing negatively. So the third pillar is job search and progression confidence, which is positive and rose towards the end of last year in Q4, the last 3 months of the year. So the biggest positive contribution to this was from involuntary part-time work. So this is probably a factor of the fact that there are so many vacancies at the moment. It's relatively easy to find a job. So if you're working part-time, but you actually want to be working full-time, which is what that measures, it's quite easy to find a full-time job. And so that is a very positive contributor to this pillar and also rose towards the end of last year. Similarly, our survey-based indicator asking around how you feel about your career progression over the next 5 years was positive and also grew towards the end of last year. So people are feeling positive about their careers despite all this macroeconomic turmoil, which I'll come on to. So yeah, we can see in this chart in the top right-hand of the slide that it was macroeconomic confidence was quite positive in 2021 and 2022 until the second half of last year when it really dropped off a cliff. So what's going on in the macroeconomy? Well, where to start? Obviously, the cost of living crisis is having a huge impact, and it's mainly driven by very high inflation. In the UK, it stood well above 10% for Q4. And so consumers just can't purchase as much with their income because their income isn't growing at the same rate of inflation. And similarly, businesses are experiencing very high input cost growth, which they can decide to pass on to consumers and then risk lower demand, or they can not pass on to consumers and then take a hit to their profits. So this high rate of inflation is really impacting the UK economy. But there are other things going on. Obviously, there was the mini budgets end of September last year, which had a big impact on financial markets and in particular mortgages. So mortgage rates increased by quite a lot. Expectations were that they would go much higher, but then with Rishi Sunak becoming Prime Minister, now that has moderated slightly, but still mortgage costs and interest rates have risen by a lot over the past year in the UK. And that means it's much more expensive for businesses and consumers to borrow. So businesses aren't borrowing as much to invest, and consumers with mortgages that are flexible rate or are coming to the end of their fix are suddenly going to incur much higher costs for their mortgage. And so alongside the high rate of inflation, this rising interest rates are really hitting consumers and hitting confidence. So yeah, this is contributing quite negatively to the overall pillar, despite the tight labour market, which is a more positive impact on the overall index. So as I mentioned, we're going to come on to a bit of a tech snapshot. So the tech industry is quite interesting. So we mentioned that there's loads of vacancies in the UK economy. There's roughly 1 vacancy per unemployed person in the UK economy at the end of last year. But in the IT industry, towards the end of last year, vacancies were falling by quite a lot. So in the annual growth in vacancies in Q4 was minus 21.4%. And so while in the whole across the whole economy, there are quite a few vacancies, it's becoming tougher to find a job in the tech sector, and businesses clearly aren't hiring as much. So we did also see a contraction in Q3 of 1.5%, but then that contraction increased in size significantly in Q4. So we see fewer tech companies hiring. Despite that, they are offering higher pay. Earnings growth on an annual basis increased by 8.6% in Q4. But I think the vacancies is the key statistic that kind of shows what's going on in the tech industry. Of course, there have been lots of headlines about tech industry redundancies. And so the tech industry is a bit different to the overall economy in that businesses aren't struggling to hire so much. In fact, many aren't looking to hire and they're making redundancies. But there have been some improvements. For instance, the share of workers whose pay regularly fluctuates, which is, of course, a key indicator feeding into the overall index. That fell, and you can see that at the bottom of the table. And then finally, kind of looking at our forecast for the UK economy. So, the UK economy is really interesting at the moment. The key question, I think, is, will there be a recession? So we avoided narrowly a recession towards the end of last year with 0% GDP growth in Q4, the quarter we've been looking at. A technical recession is, of course, 2 consecutive quarters of contraction. And we are still forecasting that for the start of this year. But saying that, we're not forecasting, a global financial crisis level recession. We're forecasting 2 consecutive quarters of small contractions in Q1 and Q2 with an overall fall of 0.4% over 2023. So you might have watched the budget yesterday and you'll know that the OBR is no longer forecasting a technical recession. They are similarly like us forecasting a contraction in Q1 and 0% GDP growth in Q2. So I actually think, despite the fact that we're forecasting recession still and they're not, we actually have a very similar rate of GDP growth. They're forecasting a 0.2% contraction over the year. And whether or not there'll be no GDP growth in Q2 or a tiny bit or a small contraction, and that puts us into a recession, is hard to say, because essentially the UK economy is flatlining a bit at the moment. That's what the OBR is saying, and that's what we're saying. How it falls either side of zero is the real question. And of course, if we do fall into recession, even if it's a tiny one like we're forecasting, it does have an impact on consumer and business confidence. The word recession is very scary. When you know you're in a recession, you're probably a bit more worried about your job. Businesses might be less likely to invest. So it would be a positive thing to avoid it, even though, like I said, no one's forecasting a really deep recession. So looking kind of at the bottom right-hand chart, you can see our forecast for unemployment and real earnings. So though we're forecasting a very mild recession this year, we're not forecasting unemployment to rise by much, which is really interesting, because I think when you think, oh, what's a recession? What do I associate with a recession? The way people feel a recession is through losing their job. They feel an economic contraction because they can't afford what they usually can afford because they've lost their source of income. Whereas very few people we're forecasting are going to lose their source of income, their job. But the problem at the moment is that though people still have incomes, they can afford so much less with that income than they could a year ago. And that's due to the falling real pay, which is the dark grey line on that bottom right-hand chart. And as you can see, that's negative at the moment. It's really quite negative. And we're forecasting it to come back towards zero, so to meet inflation, but not, as you can see, really until towards the end of next year. We're forecasting it to nearly reach zero, so inflation and earnings growth to be roughly in line next year, but actually not come above zero until the end of 2024. And so that's partly because we're not actually expecting inflation to fall back to below 2%, which is the Bank of England's target, for a number of years. I think at least 3 years. We're forecasting it to fall to around 4% towards the end of this year, and then slowly continue falling, but at a very slow rate. And of course, earnings growth will have to pip above that rate of 3 to 4% in order to see real earnings growth. And so we're expecting, in particular, kind of this real earnings contraction to continue to affect the overall jobs confidence in the UK economy. But also, I think, kind of with the budget yesterday, we were comparing the situation to the autumn statement back in November. And I think, though, you know, there is a slightly negative story with things like jobs growth, pay growth. Actually, the UK economy has proven to be so much more resilient than we all thought it would be in November, with no recession last year and the possibility of no recession this year being fairly likely. And so actually, overall, we're seeing a resilient UK economy. And despite flatlining GDP growth, essentially, the jobs market is still very hot. It's relatively easy to find a job and people feel confident in that. So there are lots of positives to do with the UK economy at the moment, despite all the downside risks. And so I think it's a really interesting time, and it'll be really interesting to see how it develops over this year as we release more quarterly reports. And that's it from me. And I think we have some time for questions now.
Thank you, Josie. That's some great insight there. And yeah, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, which I think you've answered to some degree, but maybe you can just give a little bit more insight if you feel necessary. So I think you answered the one regarding do we believe there will be a recession in 2023? I think you talked about recession versus contraction. The other part of that is, with the OBR announcement that the UK will avoid a technical recession, will that boost the economic confidence? And if so, what impact do you think that will have on companies' hiring intentions?
Well, yeah, I think I kind of mentioned, but a recession, even if it's a very small one, like we're forecasting, just knowing that you're in a recession, I think makes businesses less likely to invest, less likely to hire, because you're more worried about the future. So even the announcement yesterday that the OBR is no longer forecasting recession will have had some positive impact on people's confidence in the economy. And indeed, when the Q2 data comes out and we know for sure whether or not there's been a recession in the first half of this year, that will definitely affect businesses as well. You know, if they feel sure that the economy is growing, and for instance, inflation is slowing, which is probably the biggest thing affecting GDP at the moment, then businesses will be more willing to invest and more willing to hire. And that inevitably is what fuels GDP growth. So when people feel positive, it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just to mention as well, if anyone does have a question, feel free to use the Q&A box to pop it in there, and we can ask Josie. But I've got a few others, Josie, from my colleagues as well. So first question is, in what ways do you think that this is a unique economic cycle?
I definitely think it's unique. So we saw in one of the first charts kind of the back history of the index going back to 2009. And of course, while there was a technical recession in 2020, that's not a very standard recession because it was kind of artificially induced by the UK government with lockdown. So looking back to the last kind of comparative recession in 2009, which was obviously a very deep recession and hit people quite hard. But the unemployment rates increased so much, you know, people were really struggling to find jobs. And we saw that with many years of a negative jobs confidence index. And yet here we are talking, maybe there'll be a recession, but certainly, as I said, flatlining GDP growth, the economy isn't really growing. And yet people find it relatively easy to find a job. They feel very confident in the labour market. Businesses are still hiring, and they're struggling to hire across a lot of sectors. And so it's really interesting in that way. Like I said, people in this recession probably aren't going to lose their main source of money, which is their job, their income. But like I said, their real earnings are falling, so they can't afford as much. And that's where this crisis is hitting, in the cost of living, in people's ability to pay all their bills, especially at the lower end of the income spectrum. You still got income, but you might not be able to pay all your rent and afford food. And that's where it's struggling. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting times. Someone else has put a question in which I've been talking a lot about recently myself as well. So you mentioned the IT sector, and you see in the press there's been a lot of layoffs in some of the big tech firms. Are you seeing any large swings in particular types of roles within the IT sector? Do you feel that are there any insights into whether these are support functions that are sort of being reduced, or are there any insights into the technical elements of what tech companies are doing with the vacancies and what they're looking to hire or looking to offload?
Yeah, so when I've looked at the data on tech, I haven't looked at that by occupational level. I don't know if you know more on that than I do. But tech is definitely an interesting industry. And of course, it's become even more interesting over the past week with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank. So we might see that in the next quarter of data, with the impact of Q1 really impacting confidence in that sector. And of course, in the UK, we got quite a comparatively good deal with HSBC, and the government managed to manage that. But people are still talking about a banking crisis. And so, I mean, that will impact a lot of industries, not just tech, with the ability for them to get loans. But we could see further drop off in hiring in tech due to the tightening of people's ability to get finance. So I think that's another interesting point on the tech sector. I mean, looking at vacancies, tech vacancies have dropped a lot, not just in the UK, in particular in the US. Actually, it's even more stark. The areas where there are vacancies are in particular hospitality and healthcare, which I think are interesting because those industries are known for comparatively weak pay growth. In particular healthcare, we've got all these strikes at the moment. And so I think perhaps an interesting phenomenon at the moment is that people, can have the ability to pick roles as they choose because there are so many vacancies. And so if a role is perceived as underpaid, and I'm sure this is true for the tech industry as well, then people aren't going to apply for it because there are other jobs going. And so what I'd say is, without knowing too much about the different occupational levels of the tech industry, it's, people aren't going to apply for a job if they think the wages don't match kind of the time needed and the effort needed, because there is such a hot labour market at the moment. Absolutely.
A very apt question for today, given what's going on with the strikes at the moment. There's a lot of people logging on from home, certainly in and around London. But how is the disruption of strike action impacting job confidence? And how do you see that changing over the quarter and the knock-on effect from what we've seen so far over the last few months with all the strikes?
Well, I think I have 2 points to make here. There's kind of like a macroeconomic level and maybe slightly more of the micro level answers. So on the macroeconomic level, strikes have been affecting GDP. We saw that in particular in the services sector in December when there were lots of strikes. And of course, the overall level of economic growth in the economy then has an impact on jobs confidence, because if businesses haven't been able to open because of a strike, and then we see a recession because of persistent strikes, then that will have an inevitable impact on jobs confidence. Thinking about it kind of the other way round, I think people are striking because they don't have confidence in the labour market, in particular, obviously pay. There are slightly more specific issues in some industries, but people aren't being paid enough. Doctors, they're asking for a huge increase because inflation has absolutely battered their wages over the last couple of decades. And so I actually think it's kind of the other way around. Lack of confidence, in particular in some industries in the labour market, is forcing them to strike. And that's in particular from the pay confidence pillar. So, we're saying overall there's good confidence in the economy, but in some industries in particular, that pay confidence pillar will be very weak, and that is why they're striking. So it's kind of the other way around is the causality, I would say.
Makes sense. That's good insight. And next question, which is again very timely. With everything going on in the banking sector, will it lead to a tightening in lending? If that does happen, will that trigger a worse than predicted recession?
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question, actually, and it kind of is something that we're starting to look at deeply. You know, yesterday we kind of all got sidetracked by the budget, but actually that might possibly be the bigger story this week. So obviously we saw Silicon Valley Bank, but also now everyone's talking about, you know, what will be the impact of Credit Suisse. Yeah. And I think you're certainly right. You know, it will be harder to get a loan, both for businesses, but also there'll be a mortgage impact if this banking crisis spreads. You know, the UK government, I think, did a very good job with managing the fallout of Silicon Valley Bank. But if this spreads into a wider banking crisis, that will certainly have an impact on GDP growth. And I think, yeah, with looking at 2009 as our latest recession, aside from COVID, you know, it's very worrying when you talk about banking crisis, because we all saw the impact of that on the jobs confidence index, but indeed experienced it in our own lives. And so banking crises are very serious. Hopefully we've learned the lessons from 2009 with things like resolving banks that are struggling and limiting the fallout of a banking crisis. But I think it certainly could have more negative impact on GDP than many forecasters have started to incorporate, because it's kind of all happened so recently. I doubt the ABR really were thinking about the impact of that when they made their forecast a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And could you just maybe give us a little more insight into the CEBR's forecast relating to inflation rates and what you see happening?
Yeah, so the ABR Office for Budget Responsibility kind of released forecasts alongside the budget statement, and they kind of assess what the government said. And so they also released their inflation forecast yesterday. So I'll talk a bit about ours and then compare it to theirs, which I think is interesting. So obviously inflation has been above 10% for a few months now, and the Bank of England's target is 2%. So it's really high, and it's creating a lot of issues. We're forecasting it to come down below 5% to nearly 4% by the end of this year. So obviously that's a big slowdown, and will be a great relief when it gets that near 2%. But one of the main reasons for that is just energy. So kind of energy was one of the main factors that drove this inflation crisis, obviously predominantly caused by the war in Ukraine, but although inflation was picking up even before that. And so we've started to see energy prices come down by quite a lot. Obviously, that's impacting things like the energy price cap. The Ofgem energy price cap has fallen quite a lot. It kind of underlies the government price cap that we've got at the moment. So that's been the main thing that has caused slowing inflation over the past few months. But things like food price inflation is still very strong. And so to see inflation come down across the board, we need it to like spread through the whole economy. And I think there were a lot of worries that inflation can be surprisingly sticky, so like can stay high for longer than many are forecasting. And we kind of need the impact of slowing energy prices to have an impact throughout the economy on things like, you know, food producers also lowering their prices if their costs get lower. But an area where inflation can be very sticky in particular is wage growth. You know, if people have got used to bargaining for a 5% increase because they know inflation is so high, and they get that, then next year they might also think, oh, I got a 5% increase last year, I want that again, even if inflation is back below 5%. And that's where it can make price growth remain high. So actually, next year, 2024, the ABR is expecting inflation to fall towards zero, but actually we're expecting it to stay higher for a lot longer at around 2%. So it's still the Bank of England's target. But actually we think inflation can be surprisingly sticky, and we're not certainly not going to see deflation of kind of a negative correction in prices, especially if we see things like wage growth remain relatively high.
Makes sense. Thank you. So you talked a little bit about the UK being maybe quite on a flat line at the moment. So how do we move away from long-term stagnation to achieve more sustainable growth? Is solving the long-term labour shortage key to this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think you can look at growth. I think you can divide it into kind of two ways to get growth. You can have each worker produce as much as they did before, but have more workers. And then, of course, you multiply the two and you get more output. And so that's a key way to get growth, is just to get more people working. And that's kind of what the government was targeting yesterday predominantly, is trying to get the inactive population back to work, back to wanting jobs, through incentivizing mothers to come back to work with free childcare, incentivizing more experienced people to continue working or even exit early retirement through the pensions incentives. So you can grow the economy by getting more people to work and produce the same amount as they were before. Or with the same size labour market, you can grow the economy by increasing productivity, so the amount each person is producing. And that in a way is like one of the most sustainable ways to grow the economy, if you're not constantly seeing a growing birth rate and high immigration. So targeting productivity is very important, but is very tricky as well. So again, we saw some policy to try and help this. For instance, the tax incentives for businesses to invest. Investment is hugely important for long-term productivity. If businesses invest in technology, then each worker should be able to produce more, because they're using that technology to help them produce. You should need fewer workers if you've got better technology. I think a key issue, though, in the economy actually is businesses investing in technology, but then not training their workers to use it effectively enough. And then you've kind of got this ability to increase productivity, but people aren't using it enough because the workers don't fully understand how to use it as effectively as they could. So I think the two have got to go hand in hand: specific training in technology usage for workers and investment in technology to get productivity up. But the UK has had a productivity puzzle since the financial crisis. Our productivity growth has basically been flat when it was growing consistently before the financial crisis. So the issue of how to get productivity up to get growth is a key question that people have been scratching their heads about for over a decade now. So
absolutely,
yeah,
it's a tough one. But so just back to the report, do you see any fluctuations in some of the indicators or some of the pillars that we see related to the size of business, or like the SME market versus the FTSE? Do you see any changes or fluctuations there?
It's an interesting question, and we haven't produced it by business size. But I guess to think through some of the indicators and how they might be affected by business size. I guess businesses that are kind of larger might be more able to kind of increase wages of their workers, but that obviously depends on whether or not they're seeing higher revenue growth. And so possibly, a fast growing small business is more able to pay their workers in line with inflation. So it's kind of business success is more dependent on pay confidence than business size. Things like job security, often people feel more secure in a job at a large company because it's existed for longer probably, and it's more resilient to some shocks to the economy. And so it might be that larger businesses benefit from their size and that employees feel more secure there. And so I imagine that might have an impact as well.
Okay, we've got 1 minute, so maybe one last question, but what are the risky so-called black swans on the global horizon that could affect the UK economy negatively?
Mm-hmm. I think, they're coming out of the woodwork left, right and centre with things like Silicon Valley Bank. Obviously, we got the war in Ukraine last year. A big risk factor to the global economy is China and what policies they take, particularly in respect to Taiwan. What will be the impacts, of a possible invasion there? We don't know, but there are risk factors there. I think all eyes on China in terms of what might happen there and how that might impact the global economy. Other things to do with, for instance, China reopening and the impact of their consumption of energy can have a big impact on the global economy. But I think it was touched on, the banking crisis is a key question at the moment. What will be the impact of Silicon Valley Bank and Credit Suisse and other lenders if they're less willing and able to lend to consumers? So there's lots going on, and there could be any number of other black swans, global warming, creating more extreme weather events. So who knows? But we've definitely experienced a lot of shocks lately.
Absolutely. Well, look, Josie, thank you so much for your insights. put you on the spot with a few of those questions, but I think you give us a brilliant insight into what's going on and what we can expect. So this is the first one. We will be producing this report quarterly, so hopefully it'll be great if people can join us again to see how things have changed for Q1 of 2023. You can download the report or see the report on the Robert Half website and take a read through it yourself in a bit more time. It would also be good if you want to reach out to your Robert Half representative. You can get a copy from them as well. So without further ado, we'll let everyone get back to their day. Thanks so much again for joining us. Josie, thanks again for your time. I know you're extremely busy, so great to have you on, and we look forward to seeing everyone again in a quarter's time. Thanks all.